I am Eloise Scott, 32 years old. Mud from Arlington National Cemetery is still caked on the heels of my combat boots. Less than 30 hours after the honor guard folded the flag over my grandfather's casket, I found myself standing in the middle of my own living room. The sound of ice cubes clinking against crystal was the only thing breaking the silence. My father took a sip of his bourbon and tossed his Tesla keys onto the marble countertop. He swiped my gear aside like it was trash and tilted his chin up. He told me the lawyer had finished reading the will and that I finally understood my place. My mother didn't even look up from her iPad as she smoothed the wrinkles on her black silk dress. She told me to pack my things because she was changing the security codes at 9 o'clock tonight. They stripped me of my home the same night I lost the only person who actually gave a damn about me. They think I am going to break down and beg for mercy. But what they don't realize is that the Admiral who just went into the ground left a legal landmine right under their gold-plated heels. Let me know where you are listening from in the comments and hit that follow button if you have ever been dragged through the mud by your own flesh and blood just for the sake of $1. The silence that followed Lawyer Callahan's departure was heavier than the humidity hanging over the Virginia coast. It was the kind of silence that does not just sit in a room, it suffocates it. I stood there in the center of a living room that had been my sanctuary for 30 years, but suddenly felt like a stranger's museum. My combat boots were still damp from the Arlington grass, and every time I shifted my weight, I could feel the grit of graveyard soil grinding against the expensive Persian rug. Richard. My father did not care about the rug or the soil or the fact that we had just buried his own father yesterday. He only cared about the stack of papers in his hand. I watched as he lunged for the second copy of the will the moment the front door clicked shut. His eyes darted across the pages, his index finger tracing the bold lines of text, like a man looking for buried treasure. He found what he wanted. He found the phrase grantor's entire real estate portfolio, and just like that, his posture changed. His shoulders squared, and he tilted his chin up with a look of smug satisfaction that made my stomach churn. He did not say a word to me at first. He just turned on his heel and walked over to the mahogany bar. I heard the sharp snap of plastic as he ripped the seal off a bottle of reserve bourbon, the one my grandfather had been saving for a special occasion. Richard did not ask. He just poured. He dropped 2 ice cubes into a crystal tumbler, and the sound of them hitting the glass rang out like a gunshot in that 400 square meter space. Clink, clink. It was the sound of a man who had finally won a game he had been playing for decades. He took a long sip and let out a slow breath of alcohol-scented air. Behind him on the mantel sat a framed photo of the Admiral in his full-dress whites with a black ribbon draped across the corner. My grandfather was looking straight ahead with that steady gaze that always made me feel safe. But Richard had his back turned to the photo. He was already looking at the Tesla keys he had tossed onto the marble countertop as if they were the only things that mattered now. My mother Eleanor was standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out at the gray choppy waters of Norfolk Bay. She did not look back at me either. She was too busy smoothing out an invisible wrinkle in her black silk dress. She had this way of using her charity gala voice even when she was delivering a death blow. She told me in a low, measured tone that since the lawyer was gone, I should probably start thinking about my next move. She did not use the word eviction. People like Eleanor Scott do not use words like that. She just said that the house belonged to them now, and that an officer in the United States Army should not be mooching off her parents indefinitely. She actually used the word mooching. I felt the air leave my lungs. My service, my deployments, the years I spent away from home while they lived off the Admiral's prestige, it all meant nothing. To her, I was just a messy detail, a smudge on her perfectly curated life. She adjusted her pearl necklace and finally looked at me, but her eyes were as cold as the bay water. She looked at my wrinkled uniform and the mud on my boots as if I were a piece of trash that had blown in through an open window. I did not argue. I did not beg. I knew that look. It was the same look they gave me when I was 10 and I did not win the right trophy, or when I was 20 and I chose the academy over the Ivy League. I just turned and walked toward the stairs. My boots hit the oak steps with a series of hollow thuds that echoed through the house. Every step felt like a mile. When I got to my room, I did not turn on the lights. I did not need to. I grabbed my TA-50 duffel bag from the closet and started throwing things in. 3 sets of ACUs, 2 pairs of wool socks, and the small wooden box that held my grandfather's medals. I moved like a machine. I did not let myself feel the burn in the back of my throat or the way my hands were shaking. I just focused on the sound of the metal zipper. It screamed as I pulled it shut, ridding the silence of the room. I reached for a photo on my nightstand. It was a picture of me and the Admiral on the day I was commissioned. He was beaming, holding my hand so tight I thought he would never let go. I tucked it deep into the bottom of my pack. Downstairs, I could hear the muffled sound of the television. They had already turned on the financial news. The world was ending for me, but for them it was just another Tuesday with a better stock portfolio. When I got back to the front door, Richard was waiting. He did not move to help me with the heavy bags. He just stood there with one foot wedged against the edge of the heavy oak door, as if he was afraid I might try to sneak back in. He reached out and grabbed the straps of my bags before I could even set them down, and he tossed them. He actually threw them onto the wet sidewalk. I watched as my life landed in a puddle of muddy water. The splashing sound felt like a slap in the face. Richard did not look ashamed. He just held out his hand palm up. He told me to give him the gate keys. My fingers fumbled with the cold metal of the keychain. For a second before I dropped them into his hand. I did not say a word. I could not. I just stepped out onto the porch and the door slammed shut behind me. I heard the electronic lock cycle with 2 sharp chirps. A new security code. In the span of an hour, I had lost my home, my parents, and the only place on earth I thought I belonged. I stood there on the curb under the freezing rain, feeling the water soak through my patrol cap and run down the bridge of my nose. I was an officer in the most powerful military on earth, and yet I had nowhere to go. I was just another veteran staring at the mud, wondering how a family could be more dangerous than a war zone. The rhythmic sweep of the windshield wipers on my Jeep Wrangler was the only thing keeping me from drifting into a total stupor. Swish, swish, swish. The orange glow of the streetlights near the edge of the property caught the raindrops, turning them into little amber sparks before they were wiped away. My mind was a mess. It kept sliding back in time, back to when I was 10 years old, and the world smelled like my mother's suffocating hairspray. Actually, it was Aquanet, that heavy chemical mist that Eleanor used to build her social armor every Sunday morning before the Norfolk Yacht Club luncheons. I could still feel her fingers digging into my shoulders, her manicured nails biting through the thin fabric of my dress as she shoved me toward the bathroom. She did not look at me with love. She looked at me like I was a cracked vase she was trying to hide from the guests. "Go wash the mud from under your fingernails, Eloise," she had hissed, her voice a sharp contrast to the practiced smile she wore for the mayor's wife. "Do not you dare embarrass me today." The stiff, cheap lace of that dress she had forced me into was clawing at my neck, leaving my skin itchy and red. But she did not care. She just turned her back, positioned my younger brother for the camera, and beamed for the photographer while I stood alone behind the heavy velvet curtains. That was how it always was. I was the shadow, the scapegoat, the girl who did not fit the Scott family brand. But then there was Grandpa Thomas. I remember him stepping out of that loud, fake ballroom, his uniform crisp and his eyes tired of the nonsense. He did not say a word to Eleanor. He just reached out, grabbed the collar of my coat, and pulled me into his library. That room was my cathedral. It smelled of old leather books, mahogany, and that heavy, earthy scent of briar pipe tobacco. He sat me down on a stool that was way too tall for me and pulled a length of rough naval rope from his desk. It was not the kind of rope you would see on a fancy yacht. It was salt-stained and smelled of the Atlantic. He threw it onto the table and told me to stop crying over people who could not see my value. "Sit down," he said, his voice like grinding gravel. "Tie a figure 8. My small hands fumbled with the hemp fibers. They were coarse and they burned. The friction against my palms made my skin raw, but Grandpa's calloused hand stayed steady on top of mine, guiding me through the loops. He told me that weak people spend their lives seeking attention through expensive clothes and shiny things. But the strong create their own safety lines. He tightened the knot until it was a perfect, unbreakable symbol of utility. He asked me if I had the hunger to stand on my own 2 feet without anyone's permission. I just nodded, biting my lips so hard it bled just to keep the tears from falling. He did not hug me. He did not tell me it would be okay. Instead, he reached into his pocket and slid a heavy brass compass across the table. It was cold and scratched, but it was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. "Keep this in your pocket, Eloise," he had said. "It does not matter who closes the door on you as long as you know which way is north." A distant freight train whistle blew, the sound echoing across the bay and snapping me back to the present. I was not 10 anymore. I was 32, a captain in the army, and I was sleeping in the reclining driver's seat of my Jeep because my parents had changed the locks on my life. The air inside the cabin was biting, creeping through the cracks in the window. I pulled the rough wool military blanket tighter around my shoulders, but the chill was coming from the inside. I reached into my left chest pocket, my fingers finding the familiar weight of that brass compass. The glass was cracked now, a souvenir from a rough landing in a dusty valley halfway across the world. But the needle still hunted for the truth. I looked back at the mansion. The windows of my parents' bedroom were glowing with a warm, golden light. They were probably sleeping on 400 thread-count sheets, dreaming about their next investment while their only daughter was shivering in a parking lot. They had never once looked out the gate. They never even checked if I had enough gas to get down the road. Here's the thing about family. Sometimes the people who are supposed to be your anchor are the ones trying to sink your ship. I know I am not the only one who has sat in a cold car wondering how the people who gave you life could treat you like a stranger. If you have ever felt invisible in your own home or had your worth measured by a bank account instead of your character, I need you to know you are not alone. Please hit that like button and leave a comment below just saying, "I am here," if you have ever had to build your own family from scratch. Your stories are the ones that keep me going, and I want to hear from you. I turned the key in the ignition just enough to get some heat flowing, but the engine groaned as if it were as tired as I was. I kept my eyes on that mansion until the lights finally went out, leaving the world in a deep, unforgiving black. I did not have a house anymore, and I did not have a grandfather to tell me what knot to tie next. All I had was a cracked compass and a memory of a man who told me that my value was not up for debate. Tomorrow, I would have to find a way to survive without the Scott name. I would have to find my own north. The gray fog pressed against the glass of my Jeep Wrangler at the I-64 rest stop, thick enough to hide the world 10 feet away. I tried to shift my weight, but my spine felt like a rusted hinge that hadn't been oiled in a century. A series of sharp pops and cracks echoed in the quiet cabin as I straightened my back. Sounds like dry kindling snapping under a heavy boot. My right leg was completely dead from the hip down, a swarm of pins and needles stabbing into the skin as I forced it to move. I reached for the center console and flipped the lid with a shaky hand. I emptied my leather wallet onto the plastic tray, and the sound was pathetic. A few wrinkled $1 bills and 3/4 clattered onto the surface. 12% battery. I stared at the dark screen, waiting for a text from my mother or a missed call from Richard, even though I knew better. Nothing. Just the dim, gray light of a Virginia morning and the smell of cold upholstery that seemed to be soaking into my skin. I pushed open the heavy door to the Exxon restroom, and the smell of ammonia hit me like a physical blow to the face. It was sharp, sterile, and overwhelming. The kind of smell that tries to scrub away years of road grime, but never quite succeeds. I turned the handle of the stained porcelain sink and splashed ice-cold water onto my face until my skin felt numb. I did it again and again, trying to shock the exhaustion out of my system. Looking into the mirror was a mistake. The water spots on the glass blurred my reflection, but I could still see the dark, heavy hollows under my eyes. I looked like a ghost wearing camouflage. I grabbed a makeup wipe from my kit and scrubbed at a smear of Arlington mud on my collar, rubbing until the fabric was raw. I pulled my blonde hair back into a tight, practical bun at the base of my neck and yanked the zipper of my tactical jacket up to my chin. I had to look like a soldier, even if I felt like a stray dog kicked out into the rain. Waffle House is the only place in America that feels honest at 5 in the morning. The air inside was a thick, humid blanket of scorched pork grease and that cheap yellow corn syrup they keep in the sticky pitchers on every table. I walked up to the Formica counter, feeling the slight tackiness of the surface under my palms. and laid out 4 crumpled singles. I asked for a black coffee, no sugar, no cream. I needed the burn. The woman behind the counter had seen better decades, her skin lined like a road map of the South and her eyes knowing exactly what a person in crisis looked like. She slid a styrofoam cup toward me and then pushed a small plate with a burnt, flaky biscuit over the counter. She told me to take it, her voice low and gravelly, saying I looked like I was about to keel over right there on the stool. I didn't argue because I didn't have the energy to be proud. I just nodded and took a bite. It was dry and tasted like salt and baking soda, and it felt like swallowing a handful of sand, but I forced myself to get it down. My throat was swollen and sore, probably from standing in the graveyard rain, but I needed the fuel to keep my head up. A television was mounted in the corner of the diner, flickering with the early morning financial news. Some guy in a $5,000 suit was standing in front of a digital board, waving his hands and talking about stock indices, market volatility, and billionaire portfolios. It felt like a broadcast from another planet, a world where people worried about numbers on a screen instead of where they were going to sleep when the gas ran out. I shoved my hands deep into my pockets and felt the cold fabric of my trousers. Suddenly, the cracked screen of my phone on the counter started to buzz. It rattled against the formica, the vibration making my teeth ache and drawing a look from the trucker 3 stools down. Area code 757. Norfolk, Virginia. The words Callahan Law Office flashed in the dim light of the diner. I felt a jolt of something sharp. Not hope, but something like it. I pressed my calloused thumb against the glass to pick up just as a bead of black coffee dripped from the rim of my cup and smeared across the back of my hand, hot and bitter. I pressed the cracked screen of my phone against my ear so hard the plastic bit into my skin. Behind the counter of the Waffle House, the industrial espresso machine let out a high-pitched hiss that sounded like a steam pipe ready to burst. It was a sharp, ugly noise that cut through the low murmur of truckers and early shift workers. Lawyer Callahan's voice came through the speaker, compressed and slightly distorted, but every syllable was as precise as a briefing in a war room. He did not ask how I was doing or offer some hollow condolences about the funeral. He went straight for the jugular. He asked me if my parents had requested that I leave the premises yet. I looked down at the dried gray mud clinging to the toe of my combat boot. The grit was a reminder of the night before, of standing in the rain while my life was tossed onto a wet sidewalk. I told him they had and that it happened last night. There was a stretch of silence on the other end of the line that lasted exactly 3 seconds. It was not the silence of someone feeling sorry for me. It was the silence of a sniper who had just watched his target step into the kill zone. Callahan let out a long, slow breath that sounded more like a whistle of satisfaction than a sigh. He told me to drive to his office immediately and to use the back entrance on the alleyway. 40 minutes later, I was pulling my Jeep onto Granby Street. The rain had slowed to a miserable drizzle that made the old brick buildings of Norfolk look like they were weeping. I found the back entrance to Callahan and Burke and stepped into a world that smelled of old money and expensive leather. Callahan was already there, waiting in a room lined with floor-to-ceiling oak shelves packed with law books that had not been moved in decades. He had his sleeves rolled up to his elbows and his silk tie was nowhere to be seen. He looked like a man ready for a fight, not a legal consultation. He turned the heavy brass deadbolt on the door with a click that felt final and absolute. On the center of his cluttered desk sat a single manila envelope sealed with a thick glob of red wax. He pushed a crystal ashtray aside and tapped his index finger against the wood with a rhythmic, steady thud. He told me that the will everyone heard on Saturday was nothing more than a decoy, a piece of theater meant to draw out the opposition. My grandfather had established what Callahan called a 48-hour tactical retreat. The Admiral knew exactly who Richard and Eleanor were, and he had planned for their greed with the cold efficiency of a naval blockade. Callahan began flipping through a thick stack of legal documents, his fingers moving with a practiced speed until he reached the very last page. This was the part my parents had never heard, the hidden payload in the Admiral's final orders. He told me the Admiral's rules of engagement were simple as he pushed the paper across the desk toward me. I leaned forward and let my eyes trace the sharp, slanted lines of the italicized text. It was a conditional inheritance. Richard and Eleanor were only allowed to keep the estate if they met 3 non-negotiable conditions. They had to grant me indefinite residency, they had to allow me full oversight of the family trust, and they had to continue funding the Admiral's veteran outreach program. I felt a cold, sharp chill run down my spine as the reality of it hit me. Callahan tapped the end of his fountain pen against the desk and told me that by throwing my bags into the street and changing the security codes, they had violated every single clause before the ink was even dry on the death certificate. He said the ownership of the Scott mansion had automatically triggered a transfer. It did not belong to them anymore. It belonged to me. Immediately. The irony of it was a bitter weight in my chest. They thought they were disposing of me like a piece of broken gear, but they had actually activated a self-destruct sequence on their own future. They had been so eager to strip me of my dignity that they had stripped themselves of everything the Admiral had ever built. They did not even last 24 hours before their own narcissism pulled the trigger on the trap. Callahan slid the cap off a heavy silver Parker fountain pen and pointed to the dotted line at the bottom of the transfer deed. He told me to sign it and welcome me back as the rightful owner of the Scott estate. I did not hesitate. I grabbed the pen and pressed the steel nib into the paper with everything I had left. I watched the dark blue ink bleed into the grain of the page, staining it with a permanent mark that felt more like a victory than a signature. The ink was so thick it nearly tore through the back of the paper. I was no longer a stray dog shivering in a parking lot. I was the commanding officer now. And I was going back to Norfolk to take what was mine. The blue light from my cracked phone screen felt like a needle jabbing into my eyes in the pitch-black darkness of the underground parking garage. I was sitting in the driver's seat of my Jeep, the engine idling with a low, rhythmic vibration that I could feel in the base of my skull. The air down here was heavy with the smell of damp concrete and the faint, stinging scent of old exhaust. I didn't have anywhere else to go, so I just sat there, watching the dust motes dance in the glare of the dashboard. Then, the notification banner slid down from the top of the screen. An email from Richard. There was no subject line, no, "Hello Eloise," no, "Are you safe?" It was just a cold, clinical PDF attachment. I opened it, and my stomach did a slow, nauseating flip. It was a receipt for a public storage unit, $200 for a month of space in a windowless metal box on the outskirts of town. Below it, my father had typed a single, jagged paragraph. He told me they had hired a crew to clear out my room while I was at the cemetery. Every book I had ever read, every uniform I had earned, and every scrap of my personal history had been dumped into that unit. He said I needed to Venmo the money to my mother by Friday morning. If the payment didn't clear, he told me he would authorize the facility manager to dispose of the contents by incineration. He was charging me for the privilege of being erased. Before I could even process the bile rising in my throat, the phone buzzed again, an iMessage this time. Eleanor. My mother didn't do emails. She preferred the rapid-fire aggression of a text message thread. She was demanding the passcode for the steel safe in Grandpa Thomas's study. She said a group of high-end antique collectors from Richmond were currently standing in the living room, waiting for her to open it. Apparently, they had offered a significant sum for the Admiral's collection of 19th-century maritime chronometers and his service medals. The medals. The ones he had bled for in the Pacific while Richard was busy finding ways to dodge the draft. They weren't even waiting for the dirt on his grave to settle. They were like vultures picking over the remains of a legacy, tearing apart the only things that held our family's history together just so they could have a few more zeros in their checking account. My hands tightened on the steering wheel until my knuckles turned a ghostly white, the leather cover creaking under the pressure. I didn't reply. I just stared at the screen as the typing bubbles appeared and disappeared, like Eleanor was struggling to find a way to make her greed sound like common sense. I made the mistake of opening Facebook. I knew I shouldn't have, but I couldn't stop myself. It was like pressing on a bruise just to see if it still hurt. There she was, right at the top of my feed. My mother had posted a photo of herself in that black silk dress she wore to the funeral, but now she was holding a glass of expensive white wine. She was standing by the fireplace, the warm glow of the mansion's hearth casting a golden light over her perfectly coiffed hair. The caption was a masterpiece of narcissistic hypocrisy. She wrote that the Scott family was hosting a private tribute gala tonight to honor the memory of the great Admiral Thomas Scott. She claimed the mansion would continue to be a beacon for Norfolk's elite, just as her father would have wanted. "It's a heartbreaking time," she wrote, "but we must remain strong and move forward for the sake of the legacy." Below the post, dozens of comments from politicians' wives and local socialites were pouring in, praising her for her grace and strength in the face of tragedy. They didn't see the woman who had just threatened to burn her daughter's belongings. They didn't see the vultures in the living room. All they saw was the black silk and the expensive wine. The anger that had been simmering in my chest for the last 48 hours finally boiled over, turning into something cold and sharp. It wasn't just sadness anymore, it was a pure, focused clarity. They were throwing a party on his grave. They were using the Admiral's death as a social ladder while they tried to sell his soul to the highest bidder. I reached over to the passenger seat and grabbed the red leather folder Lawyer Callahan had given me. I ran my fingers over the embossed logo, feeling the weight of the papers inside, the papers that changed everything. Richard and Eleanor had activated their own destruction, and they were too busy sipping Chardonnay to notice the fuse was already lit. I tucked the folder into the door pocket of the Jeep and shifted the gear into drive. I didn't care about the storage unit or the antique collectors anymore. I had the only key that mattered now. I slammed my foot down on the gas pedal, the engine roaring as it echoed off the concrete walls of the garage. I tore out of that basement, the tires screaming as I headed straight for the coastal road. I was going back to the mansion, but I wasn't going as a guest. I was going back to take command. I jerked the steering wheel of my Jeep Wrangler hard to the left, the tires screeching against the pristine, white gravel of the driveway as I forced the mud-caked beast of a vehicle into a spot right in the center of the turning circle. I did not care about the neat parking lines or the fact that I was blocking a shimmering Porsche Panamera that looked like it had never seen a speck of real-world dust in its entire existence. A valet in a crisp red vest started jogging toward me, his hand raised in a polite but firm stop gesture, but I did not wait for him to reach the driver's side window. I kicked the door open and stepped out, the heavy metallic thud of my boots hitting the pavement silencing him instantly. He caught sight of the captain's bars pinned to my collar, glinting sharply under the crystal floodlights of the porch, and he froze mid-step, his professional smile dissolving into a mask of pure confusion. From inside the mansion, the muffled, honeyed sound of smooth jazz and the delicate, rhythmic clink of high-end glassware drifted out into the cold night air. It was the sound of unearned comfort, a siren song for people who had never had to bleed or sweat for anything they owned. I reached back into the passenger seat, my fingers curling around the cold, stiff leather of the red folder Callahan had handed me, and I adjusted my collar with a sharp, mechanical tug. I wasn't just walking into a house, I was walking into a target-rich environment, and for the first time in 32 years, I was the one with the superior tactical advantage. I didn't bother to knock. I shoved the double oak doors open with enough force that they slammed against the interior walls with a hollow, echoing boom that seemed to swallow the music whole. The foyer was packed with the cloying smell of expensive floral perfume and the sharp, salty scent of chilled caviar. In an instant, heads turned. Conversations died out in mid-sentence, leaving only the ghost of laughter hanging in the air. My mother, Eleanor, was standing at the center of a long, white-clothed buffet table, a glass of Moët raised as she chuckled at something the state senator's wife had just whispered. Her eyes tracked across the foyer and landed squarely on me, specifically on the dried, gray mud clinging to my combat trousers and the bright red tactical folder clutched in my hand. The fake, practiced warmth on her face didn't just fade, it calcified into stone. I could see the blue veins on the back of her hand bulging as she gripped the stem of her champagne flute so hard I actually waited for the crystal to shatter. She marched toward me, her designer heels clicking like a countdown on the marble floor. She hissed through her teeth, her voice low enough that only I could hear the venom, but sharp enough to draw blood, demanding to know what the hell I was doing here and reminding me, with a smug tilt of her head, that she had already changed the security codes. Richard, my father, broke away from a group of local businessmen in the corner, his face turning a mottled, angry shade of purple as he stormed over. He reached out and grabbed my elbow, his fingers digging into my arm as he tried to steer me back toward the door like a disobedient child. He whispered that I needed to get out right now, his eyes darting frantically around the room, terrified that his carefully curated social circle was seeing the unfiltered reality of his family. I didn't move an inch. I just twisted my arm and shoved his hand off me with a flick of my wrist that sent him stumbling back a step in front of his friends. I took a deliberate, heavy step forward, my combat boots stomping directly onto the center of a hand-woven Persian rug that probably cost more than my first 2 years of military salary. I left a long, jagged streak of black Norfolk mud across the delicate silk patterns. Somewhere near the grand piano, someone accidentally bumped the sound system, and the jazz cut out into a dead, ringing silence. All 40 guests, the elite, the powerful. The people who decided the fate of this city all stood there like statues, their mouths slightly open, watching the captain in the muddy boots stand her ground against the supposed king and queen of the manor. Eleanor crossed her arms over her silk dress, trying to lift her chin to regain some shred of her fading social authority. She told me, her voice echoing clearly in the silent room, that the lawyer had said the will was settled and there was nothing left to discuss. I looked her right in the eyes, and for the first time in my life, I didn't feel like the invisible scapegoat hiding behind the curtains. I smiled, but there was no warmth in it. It was the kind of smile you see on a wolf before the hunt. I told her she was right, that they had settled the first page, but clearly they hadn't bothered to read the rest of the Admiral's orders. I swung my arm and slammed the folder onto the buffet table, right next to a silver tray of caviar. The red wax seal of the Virginia State Court was staring them right in the face, a silent judge in a room full of liars. I told them to welcome themselves to my house, then I looked at the crowd and asked which one of them was going to be the first to get the hell out of my living room. Here's the thing about standing up for yourself. It is terrifying until the moment you actually do it. I spent years letting these people define my worth, letting them push me into the shadows while they basked in the light of my grandfather's legacy. But tonight, that cycle ends. I know so many of you have been in that same position, sitting at a table where you are tolerated but not respected, or being treated like a guest in your own life. If you have ever had that enough is enough moment where you finally stopped being the victim and started being the hero of your own story, I want to see you in the comments. Just type, "I am the owner," if you are taking back control of your life today. Don't forget to hit that like button to support the journey of standing tall. I watched the color drain from Richard's face as he realized I wasn't bluffing. He reached for the folder, his hand shaking, but I slapped my palm down on top of it. I told him that the Admiral knew exactly who he was, and he had built a back door into the inheritance that Richard was too arrogant to see coming. The silence in the room was so thick you could have cut it with a bayonet. I could see the senator and his wife exchanging a look that said they were already planning their exit strategy from the Scott social circle. The perfect family image was shattered, scattered across the floor like the crystal glasses they were so fond of clinking. I wasn't just taking back a house, I was taking back the dignity they had tried to bury in the mud. I stood there, chest out, chin up, waiting for the first person to move. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't waiting for permission. Richard lunged forward, his manicured fingers snatching the paper with the red court seal from the silver caviar tray. His eyes darted frantically across the legal jargon, scanning the lines like a man trying to read his own death warrant in a language he barely understood. I watched the blood drain from his face, leaving his skin a sickly, ashy gray, the color of a guttering candle flame just before it goes out. His hands began to shake, a fine, uncontrollable tremor that made the heavy parchment drum a frantic, hollow rhythm against the glass tabletop. This is impossible," he croaked. But the roar he tried to summon died in his throat, coming out as a thin, pathetic rasp. The booming voice of the Norfolk real estate mogul, the man who spent decades barking orders over steak dinners and bourbon, had vanished, leaving behind only the broken sound of a man who had finally run out of luck. He looked at the signature, then at me, but his eyes were unfocused, wild with a terror that only comes when the ground you thought was solid marble turns out to be nothing but thin ice. I leaned in, my shadow falling across his trembling hands, and I tapped my knuckle against the polished wood right next to my mother's wine glass. The sound was sharp, like a gavel hitting a block. You violated every single one of the Admiral's conditions the second you dragged my gear to the curb and changed those codes, I said, my voice low and steady, cutting through the stagnant air of the room. The rules of engagement were simple. Your greed was the trigger, and you pulled it yourself. Eleanor's jaw dropped, her mouth a dark, silent O of disbelief. In the harsh, overhead glare of the crystal chandeliers, her expensive foundation seemed to dry and crack, turning her face into a grotesque, flaking mask that couldn't hide the panic underneath. She didn't look at me. She didn't even look at the paper. Instead, her head whipped around, searching the room for a friendly face, a social ally, someone to tell her this was all just a bad joke. But the country club elite of Norfolk didn't do bad jokes, at least not when they involved financial ruin. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the faint, rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the foyer. The senator's wife, a woman who had spent the last hour whispering sweet nothings into Eleanor's ear about strength and legacy, didn't say a single word. She simply set her half-full glass of moe back on the table with a muffled click and took a deliberate step backward, distancing herself from the stench of a failing empire. It was as if a silent alarm had gone off, one only the ultra-wealthy could hear. The CEO of the local bank turned on his heel, his face a blank wall of professional indifference as he signaled his wife to get their coats. One by one, the people who had claimed to be the Scott family's closest friends began to drift toward the exit. There were no heartfelt goodbyes, no offers of help, and certainly no handshakes. They moved with a hurried, practiced efficiency, the sound of their leather soles and stiletto heels scuffing against the marble as they fled the sinking ship. They could smell the failure, a sour, sharp scent that cut through the Chanel No. 5, and they weren't about to let it stain their own reputations. Within minutes, the cavernous living room was empty, leaving behind only the black mourning drapes, the half-eaten trays of caviar, and the lingering smell of expensive wine that was already starting to turn stale. The tribute gala had become a ghost town. Richard's shoulders slumped, the expensive fabric of his suit suddenly looking 2 sizes too big for him as he sagged into a chair. The lines on his face seemed to deepen in real time, the weight of the last 10 minutes adding 20 years to his eyes. He looked smaller, older, and utterly stripped of the arrogance that had been his armor for decades. "Eloise," he whispered, his voice cracking as he swallowed hard against the dry knot in his throat. "Are you saying we have nothing left?" He looked up at me with a pathetic, pleading hope that made my skin crawl. For a fleeting second, the memory of that wet sidewalk flashed in my mind, and I wanted to throw his own words back in his face, to tell him exactly how it felt to be homeless and discarded in the rain. The temptation was a bitter, electric pulse in my veins, but I didn't give him the satisfaction of a shouting match. I just tilted my chin up, my gaze as cold as the Atlantic, and told him I would decide their fate when I was ready. I turned my back on the wreckage of their lives and walked into the shadows of the hallway, the sound of my boots, the only thing echoing in the silence. The heavy oak door to my grandfather's library gave way with a soft, weighted rustle of air against the door frame, a sound that felt like a secret being kept. I stepped inside and did not bother reaching for the light switch. I did not want to see the dust or the empty spaces where Eleanor had already started cataloging his life for sale. The room was thick with the scent of him, a heavy mixture of old leather bookbindings and the lingering earthy ghost of briar-pipe tobacco that seemed to have soaked into the very wood of the shelves. It was his kingdom, his sanctuary, and now it was mine. I navigated the space by memory, my boots making no sound on the thick sheepskin rug that sat in front of the cold hearth. The only light came from the moon, a pale silver glow filtering through the stained glass windows and casting long distorted shadows across the floor. I let myself sink into his oversized leather armchair. The leather groaned under my weight, a familiar welcoming sound that made my chest tighten. Out on Norfolk Bay, a freight ship let out a long, mournful blast of its whistle, a low vibration that seemed to rattle the very glass in the window frames and cut through the suffocating silence of the mansion. I reached out into the dark, my fingers trailing over the smooth, cool surface of the mahogany desk, until they found the walnut box tucked away in the far left corner. It was small, heavy, and carved with a simple, weathered anchor on the lid. I knew what was inside before I even opened it. My thumb found the notch and flipped the lid, revealing a thick craft paper envelope sealed with a jagged blob of red wax. Even in the dim light, I could see his handwriting. It was blocky, precise, the script of a man who had spent 40 years writing mission orders and tactical briefings. It just said, "To Eloise," in all caps. I took a slow breath and felt my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I pressed my thumb against the wax until it crumbled into red dust, then I pulled out the yellowed sheet of paper. I tilted the page toward the moonlight. His words did not crawl, they marched across the paper. He told me that if I was reading this, then the people who called themselves my parents had finally shown their true colors. He wrote that he had not set the trap in the will just to humiliate Richard and Eleanor, though he knew they deserved it. Actually, the trap was for me. It was a test. He called it an integrity check. The Admiral knew that the moment I held the power of the estate, the urge for revenge would be like a siren song in my ear. He wrote that power has a way of whispering to you, telling you that you have every right to destroy the people who broke your heart. He said I could throw them out into the street tonight and no one in the world would blame me. But then he asked the question that made the air vanish from my lungs. He told me that pulling a trigger is the easiest thing a soldier can do, but keeping your hands clean and your soul intact while you have the enemy in your sights, well, that is the real mark of an officer. I sat there for a long time, just clutching that piece of paper to my chest until the edges started to crinkle. The darkness in the room felt like it was pressing in on me, heavy and cold. My skin was hot and my jaw was clamped so tight my teeth ached. I wanted blood. I really did. I wanted to walk back into that hallway and tell Richard to start packing his silk shirts into trash bags. I wanted him to feel the exact moment the floor fell out from under him, just like I did on that rainy sidewalk. I mean, after 30 years of being the invisible daughter, the disappointment, the scapegoat, didn't I earn the right to be the one who slams the door? Every nerve ending in my body felt like it was on fire, screaming for a climax to all this pain. But then I looked back at the letter. I thought about the Admiral, a man who had faced real enemies and never lost his humanity. If I turned into a monster to defeat the monsters who raised me, then they still won. I would just be another link in the chain of abuse, another narcissist with a bank account and a cold heart. I stood up and walked to the window, watching the moonlight dance on the dark water of the bay. I could hear the faint, muffled sound of Eleanor crying in the distant wing of the house, a thin, sharp sound that did not move me at all. I wiped the moisture from my eyes with the back of my rough, calloused hand and took a deep, shaky breath. I was not a vulture, and I was not a victim anymore. I was a Scot, the kind the Admiral would be proud of. I knew exactly what the next move had to be, and it was not going to be the one they expected. I folded the letter carefully, tucked it into my pocket, and walked out of the library, leaving the shadows behind. The pale gray light of dawn began to bleed through the heavy linen curtains of the kitchen windows, cutting a sharp diagonal line across the long, solid oak dining table. I sat at the head of that table, my back straight, and my hands wrapped around a ceramic mug of black coffee. It was bitter and scorching hot, but I needed the burn to stay grounded. The house was silent except for the distant rhythmic humming of the industrial refrigerator, a sound that usually felt like luxury, but now felt like the countdown to a final judgment. I heard them before I saw them. The slow, hesitant scuff of slippers on the hardwood stairs was a far cry from the confident clicking heels and polished Oxfords that usually announced their presence. Richard and Eleanor shuffled into the kitchen, looking like they had aged a decade in a single night. Their clothes were wrinkled and their eyes were hollowed out by dark, heavy bags. My mother was the first to speak. Her voice was small and brittle like dry parchment. She stood by the counter and told me they owed me an apology. She said they had acted poorly when they kicked me out and that they were wrong to do it. I did not even look up from my coffee. I just raised my hand, a single sharp gesture that cut her off mid-sentence. I told them to save their breath. The words felt hollow and cheap, like a last-minute settlement offer in a lawsuit they knew they were losing. I reached into the pocket of my tactical jacket and pulled out a heavy ring of keys. I tossed them onto the glass center of the table. The clatter of metal against glass was a cold, ugly sound that made Richard flinch. There were the gate keys and the keys to the Tesla. I told them that I could have spent the morning calling the police and having them escorted off the property for trespassing. I mean, they were essentially squatters in a house they no longer legally owned. I told them the Admiral had taught me many things, but the most important was not to waste ammunition on targets that were already unarmed. I pushed 3 thick blue folders across the table toward them. These were the new rules of engagement. I took a slow sip of the coffee, letting the heat settle in my chest before I laid out the terms. I told them that as of 8 o'clock this morning, the main house was being converted into the Admiral Thomas Scott Veterans Outreach Fund. This was no longer a private residence for the Scott elite. It was going to be a sanctuary, a place of transition for soldiers who had been discarded by their families or the system. The very rooms they had used for their empty social galas would soon be filled with people who actually knew the meaning of sacrifice. Richard opened his mouth to protest, his jaw working as if he were trying to find a way to argue the legalities, but I did not give him the opening. I tapped my pen against the document and told them they had exactly 24 hours to pack their personal belongings. I told them they were moving into the small guest cottage on the east side of the property. It was the one they used to use for storage and the occasional live-in help. It was 50 yards away, but it might as well have been on another planet. Eleanor stared at me, her eyes wide and glassy with shock. She asked me if I was really expecting them to live in the servants' quarters. I stood up and took a moment to slowly brush a stray speck of dust off the shoulder of my uniform. I told her that was exactly what I was saying. I told them I would continue to pay for the gas, the electricity, and the water. I would not let them starve, but the days of the Scott Family Trust, being their personal ATM, were over. I set the conditions down like bricks in a wall. If they wanted to stay on the property, Richard would be responsible for the grounds. He would mow the lawn and trim the hedges he used to ignore. And Eleanor? I told her she would be in the kitchen 3 days a week, helping prepare meals for the veterans who were moving in. I told them they could either sign the behavioral agreement and start working for their keep, or they could step out onto that same wet sidewalk they had left me on 2 days ago. I told them the choice was theirs, but they needed to decide before the coffee in my cup went cold. I watched Richard pick up the pen, his fingers trembling so much he could barely grip the barrel. He looked at Eleanor, then back at the paper. There was no more talk of stocks or social standing. There was only the harsh clinical reality of their new lives. They signed. The ink was a dark, permanent streak that signaled the end of their era and the beginning of mine. I picked up my mug and walked toward the back door, leaving them standing in the ruins of their vanity. I stepped out onto the porch and breathed in the cold, salt air of the bay. The mist was starting to lift, and for the first time in my life, the Scott mansion did not feel like a prison or a museum. It felt like a mission. I was an officer, and I finally had a command that was worth the fight. 6 months have drifted by since the night the electronic locks clicked twice and changed the world as I knew it. The polished bronze plaque that once announced the Scott Manor to the neighborhood is gone now, ripped from the brick pillars and probably sitting in a scrap pile somewhere in Norfolk. In its place is a rough slab of plywood, spray-painted with the words, "The Admiral's Rest," in jagged, unpretentious letters. I walked across the lawn this morning carrying my steel toolbox, the weight of it pulling at my shoulder in a way that felt familiar and honest. The grass is not as manicured as it used to be, but it is healthy. It is alive. I stepped through the front doors, and the air hit me immediately. It did not smell like expensive lilies or French perfume anymore. Actually, the foyer was thick with the scent of fresh sawdust and white primer paint. The grand living room, the place where Eleanor used to host her champagne galas, had been stripped of its velvet curtains and Persian rugs. Now, there are 6 sets of military-grade bunk beds lined up against the walls. 2 former Marines were hunched over by the far window, their shirts soaked through with sweat as they worked a trowel across a long crack in the plaster. There was no smooth jazz playing in the background. The only music in this house now is the high-pitched scream of a circular saw and the steady, rhythmic thud of a hammer coming from the upstairs hall. I set my toolbox down and headed toward the back of the house, following the stone path that leads down to the bay. I passed the kitchen window and saw a figure moving inside the steam. It was Eleanor. She was not wearing her black silk dress or her pearls. Instead, she was draped in a heavy canvas apron that was stained with potato starch and grease. I watched her for a second through the glass. She had a strand of hair matted to her forehead by perspiration, and she was lifting a massive tray of roasted potatoes out of the industrial oven I had installed 3 months ago. 3 veterans, 2 of them missing limbs from tours in the sandbox, were sitting at the plywood dining tables outside. When Eleanor set the food down, they gave her a short, respectful nod. She did not smile back. She did not know how to be a mother yet, and maybe she never would, but she just nodded back in silence. I saw her pause for a moment to rub her swollen wrists, her face flushed from the heat of the kitchen, before she turned and disappeared back into the cloud of onion-scented steam. She'd exchanged her social standing for a kitchen shift, and for the first time in 30 years, she looked like she was actually part of something real. I found Richard down at the edge of the mossy dock. He was on his knees, his back bared to the sun, and his skin turned a deep, weathered shade of bronze. He was shirtless, his spine curving as he gripped a heavy sledgehammer with both hands. He was focused on a massive steel spike that was meant to secure a new oak beam to the rotting frame of the pier. Every time the hammer came down, it made a sharp, echoing crack that skipped across the water of the Chesapeake Bay. I stopped about 6 feet away from him, the shadow of my boots falling across the wood. He did not look up right away. He just took another swing, his muscles bunching and straining under a layer of grit and oil. When he finally lowered the hammer, he reached for a greasy rag tucked into his waistband and wiped the sweat from his eyes. He looked up at me, and his gaze was different. The arrogance was gone, replaced by the hollowed-out look of a man who had finally learned the weight of a dollar he had to earn with his own hands. He looked at the cracked wood beneath him and told me that the Admiral was right. He said it so low I almost missed it over the sound of the wind. He told me that character weighed a hell of a lot more than money ever did. I did not have anything to say to him. I did not need to offer him forgiveness or a lecture because the blisters on his palms were doing the talking for me. Words are cheap, but the work is honest. I turned my back on him and started walking along the narrow strip of sand that leads out toward the open water. The wind from the Chesapeake was brutal today, whipping across my face and carrying the sharp, stinging taste of salt and rotting seaweed. It felt good. It felt like reality. I reached into the pocket of my ACU trousers and felt my fingers brush against the cold, familiar rim of the brass compass. I pulled it out and ran my thumb along the jagged crack in the glass. The needle was dancing, hunting for north in the middle of a world that was still rebuilding itself. The sun was starting to dip toward the gray horizon, staining the cold water with streaks of deep, bloody crimson. I stood there on the edge of the world, locking my knees and digging the heels of my combat boots into the wet, packing sand. I did not have a perfect family, and the house behind me was no longer a palace. But as I looked out at the waves, I realized I did not need a museum to remember who I was. I had a mission. I had a home. And for the first time in my life, the path ahead of me was exactly the one I had chosen for myself. Watching the journey of Eloise Scott serves as a powerful reminder that our value is not a commodity to be appraised by those who do not understand our heart. This story teaches us that blood might share a name, but character is what truly defines a family. When we face the cold reality of betrayal, the most positive act we can perform is not revenge, but the creation of a legacy that serves others. True strength lies in the ability to set firm boundaries while keeping our integrity intact, proving that we can be the cycle breakers our ancestors never were. By reclaiming our own power, we transform a history of pain into a future of purpose. I hope that these chapters have resonated with anyone who has ever felt like a stranger in their own home. It takes immense courage to walk away from the ghosts of expectation and find your own North Star. And Eloise's triumph is a tribute to that resilience. If this story provided a moment of clarity or comfort, please support the channel by hitting that like button and subscribing for more stories of strength. I invite you to share your own experience in the comments below. Tell us, what does a chosen family mean to you? Your voice matters here.